Hey everybody, Harv here. Let's finish up our lecture on chapter 22, our last lecture for AP European history. Um, one of the big changes that we're going to see during the Cold War and after World War II is with art. And remember, wow, we've come on such a long journey when it's come to art from, the Renaissance, medieval art that we talked about, Baroque art, Rococo, neoclassic art, Romanticism, right? Cubism, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism. What a long journey we've had with art. And so we're going to kind of see modern art um, really reflect kind of the mood and the divisions and the tensions of the late 20th century. And it's really important to just note that art, ladies and gentlemen, has evolved so much in the 20th century. Music, the visual arts, performing arts, art has changed so much. But after World War II and during the Cold War, we're going to really, especially in Europe, see art, change and really reflect the times. In one of the changes that we're going to see is we're going to start to see this type of art called socialist realism. And what it was propaganda. Yablonskaya, her picture Bread, is an example of this, but what it did was it just showed optimistic scenes that really promoted socialism and communism, said, hey, this is a good thing, it's amazing, look how happy the people are, we're doing great, all right? And that's the propaganda aspect of this, because that necessarily wasn't always the case. Jackson Pollock is going to kind of represent the other side of this. In his painting called One, he showcased the freedom of the West and the freedom of these democratic capitalist countries in his painting. Let me kind of show you the paintings, and you'll kind of see. Here's Yablonskaya's Bread. Right, everyone's happy. They're doing great. Things are good. They're working hard. That's not necessarily wasn't the case. Not everyone was super stoked with these collective farms. But that was the idea. Is this was socialist realism trying to promote optimism within socialism and communism, in a sense of propaganda. And here's Pollock's, just kind of doing whatever he wants, just showcasing his freedom to do what he wants. Some other big changes that we're going to see, and we talked about this with the Americanization of Europe, but I would argue the Americanization of large parts of the world. New York, cities in the United States are going to become some of the new cultural centers in the world, as opposed to, where Paris was previously. And I would even argue LA is going to be a cultural center, but cultural with art, music, clothing. The United States is becoming this new cultural center for the world. Another artistic movement that we're going to see is minimalism, and this was an architectural movement that what it wanted to do was to try to make objects as simple as possible, but you could understand what they were, and you were trying to remove from an object as many features as possible while retaining the shape of the objects, so you could understand what that object was. And let me show you a picture. So trying to make objects as simple, as basic as possible, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Renaissance art and classical music, and bringing back the classics, making things balanced, simple, simplicity. Minimalism is much like that. Okay, let's talk about Christianity of the 20th century and today. Wow, think about the journey that we've taken with religion, with Christianity, from where we started in this class, right? From the Great Schism, Avignon Papacy, Boniface, through the Protestant Reformation, English Reformation, the religious wars, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, Napoleon, the French Revolution, all the way up into the 1800s with the separation of church and state, Bismarck. Right, Darwinism. Religion has been through, so much. Christianity has been through so much in this class, and it's, let's kind of talk about modern Christianity. Christianity today is definitely still on the defensive, and is attacked and very much, hard pressed during the 20th century, with consumerism, materialism, with the LGBTQ plus community gaining rights and gaining their civil rights, environmentalism. There's been loss of church membership, abortion being legalized in certain areas. The church is in Christianity has definitely been on the defensive and still is in some tough spots within Europe, but also because Christianity is now a worldwide religion all throughout the world. We do see some theological movements within Christianity during the 20th century. There's neo-orthodoxy, presented by a man named Karl Barth. He emphasized that humanity needs God, that humans cannot live without God. They are dependent upon God, and that therefore society needs God. Society is dependent upon God. You have some other liberal thinkers who, such as Tillich, Boltman, Robinson, C.S. Lewis, who regard religion as a human phenomena. It was created by humans, and it was, it's part of human culture. Divinity is part of our culture, is part of our nature, is part of our society, and it reflects our nature, it reflects our culture, it reflects society. But some of the bigger reforms that we've seen in changes in the 20th century and kind of ideas is we've seen some Roman Catholic reform during the 20th century, which is pretty unprecedented. And with Pope Francis, and I'll talk about it a little bit, we might be in store in our lifetime, in 2020, in the next 30, 40, 50 years, to see even more reform with the Roman Catholic Church. Some of the changes that we've seen is they've been more liberal towards using the vernacular in some of their services, such as Mass. Previously the Roman Catholic Church was pretty strict on using Latin, but now we're seeing them use more vernacular languages in the churches around the world. They're trying to promote better relations with other Christian Protestant denominations, with other monotheistic relations, such as Judaism and Islam. So there's been some positive changes and reforms within the Roman Catholic Church the last couple of years, which is really interesting, and some liberal changes. There has still been some conservative ideas kept, such as the celibacy of priests, the prohibition on abortion and birth control, having no women priests. But as I said before, Pope Francis, some things, there's kind of this idea that Pope Francis might be changing even more and reforming the church even more within the coming years. He has acknowledged climate change, and he might possibly allow for some of the first female priests, which is really interesting. All right, and there is Pope John Paul II, Pope during the late 20th century. Now, another huge event in the late 20th century is the invention of the computer, is the invention of the internet. And today in this, it's crazy. Like, I'm on my computer right now, and I have my iPhone next to me. That's essentially a computer and a phone put together. Like, the computer age is crazy, and the computer, I believe, is a defining technological instrument that is as important as the printing press. It is just changed everything. I mean, with distance learning going on, it's computers who are doing all the heavy lifting, the internet doing all the heavy lifting. Now, early on, in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment during the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, scientists were looking for ways to create, calculating machines. But we're going to see calculating machines, some of our modern technology really take a leap when electricity is starting to be understood and harnessed on a different level. The first actual computer is built by the United States in the 1940s. It was built for missile calculations. But then, ladies and gentlemen, during the next 50 years, we're going to see things just change so rapidly for computers. You're going to see in the 60s the invention of bitmap. All right, it allows for information to be seen on a screen. You're going to see IBM start producing the first small personal computers. Apple's going to get in the game. Steve Jobs producing Macintosh computers. And then the 80s and 90s, we're going to see personal computers boom and really accelerate with the internet. And I mean, the internet, ladies and gentlemen, is just revolutionary. It's insane. I mean, you can talk with people all around the world via the internet. You can, go on and learn so much. We have social media. The internet has just really represented just this whole digital world, this digital frontier of information, of interconnectedness, and it's we're still understanding, we're still trying to understand and improve the internet and understand its effects and how much it's transformed the world, but it has. Now, in some areas where there's a lot of electricity and that are a little bit more well off economically, they have computers and they're much more connected, and there's a lot more availability of information. There's some countries that do not have modern infrastructure with electricity and maybe lower socially socioeconomically, and they're not able to afford the technological infrastructure of internet, cell towers, et cetera, et cetera. But my point is that technology has really just taken off throughout the world. Something interesting though, like the United States kind of, and in areas of Europe and all around, like even though like you go throughout a city of like LA or New York, there are some certain areas within some of these very wealthy Western nations such as the United States and Europe where if you go to rural areas, they still struggle with getting internet, and they're maybe not as connected, and that technology isn't necessarily as readily available. So it's really interesting. Okay, look at some of these huge early computers. Think about like how all this has really just shrunken down, right? Like iPhone, which is probably more powerful than this, could just fit in this guy's hand. But this is a computer that's probably 8 times, like just nothing compared to the modern technology, and it's really interesting. Let's talk about the EU, ladies and gentlemen. During the second half of the 20th century, we're going to start to see Europe start to align itself economically, politically, and socially. And the way that I want you to think about the EU is kind of like the United States. You have different states, right? Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Cali, Texas, that are the United States, that are kind of unified together under this union governed by a federal government. We're going to start to see that kind of within EU. You're going to start to see Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands start to join together, and then you have like this EU governing body within the EU kind of help with officials from these different countries kind of overseeing them all. So it's almost like a United States of Europe in a sense. We start to see this through the European coal and steel community in the 1950s with France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And what they wanted to do was kind of just eliminate tariffs, eliminate taxes, and start to have more free trade with these goods and more economic integration. And that's just going to really start to snowball, and we're going to see, this integration, start on a, more economic and political level. The Cold War is definitely, ladies and gentlemen, going to influence this big time. And I'm so sorry, there's like a plane coming on overhead. But the Cold War is going to be super influential with this, ladies and gentlemen. The West is going to, try to unite and join forces and join together. And this is kind of an affront to Eastern Europe being, united under communism and the Soviet Union. So politics is going to be really influential in this unification. We're going to start to see the European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market, start to come out in the 1950s. And this, again, was trying to allow for the free flow of capital and labor, having similar wages and benefits. And this is what's doing amongst these countries that are joining this is facilitating a free trade union. For example, you can, be a steel worker, live in Great Britain, and commute to France to work in the mines, and you're not taxed any differently. And you don't have to show a passport. You can just show up, and it's the economic union. And that's that's eventually what we're gonna start to see is people being able to commute from France to Belgium and work there, and not pay any taxes, and be able to drive your car throughout. Like you don't have to have a passport. This is a full on unification, right? It's like in the United States, if we go from California to Nevada, we don't have to get stopped and show necessarily like a passport or we don't necessarily you know have be taxed a different tax because we're from California. It's we have economic integration and political integration and social integration. Like we can move to Nevada if we want. We have to register with the state, but we can still do it. So it not have to become a citizen of Nevada. So it's really we're starting to see some modern integration, which is really interesting. The original 6 members, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We're going to see Great Britain, Ireland, and Denmark slowly become members. We're going to see Spain and Greece join. We'll start to see some Eastern European countries join. Poland, Czech Republic, Estonia will join the EU. And this is the big one right here, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to see the European Economic Community transform into the European Union in 1993 with the Treaty of Maastricht. And they are going to develop a common currency, the euro, that they can use, right? It would be so complicated. And I'm going to go back to the United States. If we had our own California currency, right? The California dollar versus the Nevada dollar versus the Oregon dollar versus the Missouri dollar, right? This integration, this economic, political, and social integration, one of the best symbols of this is a common currency within Europe. Now, some countries don't necessarily accept. For example, when Great Britain was part of the EU, they are not a part of the EU anymore. They're still going to keep the pound, the British pound, and they have to, kind of transfer the currency when the British go to the continent. But this really was a symbol of that unification. We see membership rise to 25 countries in 2004, and many Soviet bloc countries are going to flock to this in protest to the former Soviet Union, Russia. But also, this is really beneficial to them. This is economic unity. And what's important, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that some countries don't necessarily like this all the time. For example, Greece and Spain had some debt problems and economic problems, and within the European Union, they were kind of affecting the economy of Europe. And Germany, Great Britain, and France, some of the wealthier countries, had to loan them a lot of money and kind of bail them out, and that really frustrated some people in Germany and in Spain, in France and Britain, because they're like, hey, why are we having to spend our hard-earned tax dollars to help out their government because their government necessarily can't get their act together. So it's created some tensions, and we're going to get into that. All right, let's continue. Now, like I said, this has there's been some discord within the Union. There was a considerable debate about a European Constitution of 2004. It was going to have a Bill of Rights, and it was going to transfer a lot of power from the individual nations like Great Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, to like a more central power, kind of like having your own federal government. And a lot of countries did not necessarily feel comfortable with that. They didn't necessarily want to become the United States of Europe. Okay, some of the governing countries still wanted some autonomy, but there were a couple factors that contributed to this treaty's defeat. Number one was the gap between the European elite and the voting public. Many of the elite, kind of ignored the public and had typically, small majorities in the EU, and they really didn't understand, what this treaty would have done. The public wasn't necessarily, down with it. Stagnant economies. There was a lot of unemployment among the youth, and people, saw that, transferring more power to a central kind of governing body necessarily might not work. Some of the smaller European countries felt that Britain and France and Germany and some of the larger European countries might dominate the EU, and therefore they would get left out and kind of ignored. Some nations believed that the euro put them at an economic disadvantage, in that they wanted to keep their own currency. And some countries do still have their own currency. Like, for example, Switzerland, the Swiss have the franc. They still use that. And there was a natural reluctance to secede national sovereignty and the authority to kind of like a central bureaucracy and a central bank. So really, really, really interesting. There was a lot of controversy over this about admitting a Muslim state into the EU. Okay, some countries were like, no, Turkey is not only too low income, but they necessarily didn't want a Muslim country within a predominantly Muslim country within the EU, and that kind of also represents kind of the racism during this time. Okay, the bigotry. But Europeans see Europe as a Christian group of nations, and they didn't necessarily. Europe didn't want to allow Turkey into the Union because they didn't want a further increase of influence of Islam in Europe. But the European Union today, ladies and gentlemen, is very much in trouble. Britain has left. France almost left with their last election. Macron, he supported the EU, so he stayed in, but Le Pen wanted to get out of the EU. And so with Great Britain out of the EU, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Will Scotland declare independence and stay in the EU? Because with Great Britain out, it means that Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales are out, and some of those countries want to stay in the European Union. So it's very, very, very interesting and very contentious, and we will see what happens with the EU. And again, this was part of an election. Do we stay? Okay. I think it's do we yes or no. All right. Do you stay in Europe or in the EU? And these were posters for the Constitution. So very contentious. The EU is really contentious within Europe. There's been new American leadership recently, and there's this, and we're talking about the Obama presidency. There's been a couple events that have really brought the United States and Europe together. Russia invading Georgia, that was drew a strong negative reaction from both the United States and the EU. They condemned the Russia, should not say Soviet Union, but Russia. But that was very much a Soviet Union move right there, trying to exert their influence on foreign people. The election of Barack Obama as president was very really connected Europe a little bit more to the United States. Obama was the first African-American president in U.S. history. He was very popular in Europe. He had a lot of speeches in Europe, and he was well-liked among Europeans. The worldwide financial crisis, this really put a huge burden on the EU and the United States, and it did in the 2008, 2009, 2010 really facilitate a lot of economic cooperation between the United States and the EU in order to try to get out of this. And the United States and the European governments really intervened in the economy, the world economy, in order to kind of get a kickstart and recover, which eventually it did. All right. A problem in Europe, and this kind of plagues the EU, ladies and gentlemen, is the European debt crisis. The risk of sharing a currency with poorer countries like the euro has put the burden on some of the more wealthy countries, and countries like Germany, countries like France, the Netherlands. They not necessarily the politicians, yeah, but the public, the people, are very. They don't like it when other countries within, and I kind of talked about this a little bit before, within the EU, accumulate a lot of debt or have economic problems, because eventually it's those taxpayers from these other countries that are a little bit wealthier that are having to kind of pay for that. And that's caused a lot of discontent within the EU and animosity among certain countries within the EU. It'll be really interesting to see, what will happen if the EU will survive. This raises a lot of serious questions about national sovereignty and the ability of individual states to control their own economies, with countries like Greece and Italy and sometimes Spain having lots of debt, immigration from the Middle East. People are wondering if there's going to be another Brexit soon. Okay, with France. Okay, France almost did it. They're wondering if that will happen again with France. So, be really interesting. All right, and there's a picture of Barack Obama. He was a very influential president. He helped unite the United States and Europe. Unfortunately, Donald Trump, who is the president now, has kind of done the opposite. He has denounced NATO. He encouraged Brexit, and relations between the EU and the countries within NATO are not necessarily very healthy right now under the Trump presidency, because he has demanded that they pay more within NATO. He's gone on Twitter and insulted them. So it's been really it'll be really interesting to see the evolution of the Trump administration with the EU and with NATO. All right. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me today. That's the end of chapter 22. It's the end of our class. Oh man, it's so gnarly. You all made it though. Awesome. Take care, ladies and gentlemen, and good luck on the AP exam.